Hi everyone, and welcome to a new tutorial for Simple GIS Client. In today's tutorial, we'll be covering a couple of topics for you. One, we'll be discussing how you can use an inexpensive GPS receiver, connect it to your laptop's USB or Windows tablet USB port to interface with Simple GIS Client. And so Simple GIS can support any GPS receiver that supports the NMEA 0183 protocol or supports the Windows 10 Sensor API platform. And so today we'll be covering a couple of topics. One will be discussing how you can use Simple GIS Client with offline data so that you can use it in the field with no internet connectivity and use it completely offline for a complete field GIS solution. So to begin with, if you're somewhat familiar with Simple GIS Client, you'll probably notice this screen when you first launch the application by double-clicking on its icon on your desktop or in the Start menu. The first window that will normally appear when you launch Simple GIS Client is this window that allows you to create a brand new project or open an existing project that you've previously saved. And of course, if you select this menu, it just brings you to the different options. So if I wanted to open a project, as I click on this Open Project menu item, I get the folder and file selection dialog box allowing me to select a project to open. If you're starting from scratch and creating a new project, of course, this is where you would start from by clicking on this New Project menu item, which is also the default that comes up when you first launch the application. And of course, in this main area, it just gives you a lot of different templates you can choose from to start your new project. If you wanted to, you could create a new empty project that has no preloaded base map data, and then you would just add in the additional data you want. Or you could select one of these other project templates based on different data sources that provide different base maps, and then you can still add your data on top of it. Of course, one thing to notice is most of these project templates listed here are based on web mapping services or tile mapping services, so they all require internet connectivity to actively use these base maps. And so if you're wanting a field GIS application where you may not have internet connectivity, then of course these would not be good templates to start with. However, you could create a new empty project and then add in your own local data that you have stored on your machine. Or you could create this project and then use the USGS Data Wizard and Simple GIS Client to download additional data from the USGS department to your local machine. In addition, there is one project template here, and it's called simply Street Map, Local Routable and Geocoded Detailed Street Map. So if you're going to be working in one of the US 50 states, you could use this template, and this actually allows you to download data from Simple GIS based upon whatever state you select, and it contains detailed street map data as well as feature data, and it will download it local to your machine. That once it's downloaded, then you can use it for offline use however long you need to use it for. And in addition, this data is also fully geocoded, so you can locate street addresses all offline without having internet connectivity, as well as it is also fully routable. So if you wanted to get navigation or directions from one point to another point, or even creating a route that has multiple stops, you can do that using this local data set, and you can operate all of that completely offline. So if you wanted to start with this, you could certainly start with this, and then you're also still free to add your own data on top of this as additional layers as you need to. And so for the purposes of today's demonstration, we'll just start and we'll create a brand new project from scratch using this template. Again, it's the Street Map Local Routable and Geocoded Detailed Street Map. And again, the description just tells you great for offline use. So to select this particular template, we just simply double click on its tile. It's going to create a new Simple GIS Client project for you. And in addition, you're going to get, to begin with, a new dialog box that pops up asking you to select the state that you want to download. And so if you look here, and again, this is only has coverage for the US, but you can select the state of interest. So if you were only working in a single state, you can simply select that state and then select a folder where you want it to download this data to and save your project file in. If you are working in multiple states, then you also have the option to download this very first option called All Entire US, and that'll download the entire US data set. Now that's a fairly large data set, and you can see the size of the data sets as you select it here in the status bar at the bottom of this dialog box. So it tells you what the download size is since the data is compressed. So for the entire US, the download size is about 13.5 gigabytes. And then once it's uncompressed on your hard drive, it'll be about 43 gigabytes. And then if you select a single state, you can see its size and its uncompressed size as well. So for the purpose of today's demonstration, let's go ahead and select, and I'm going to select the state of Louisiana. And then as you select the state, here on the right hand side, you can select the folder where you want to extract this data to and where it's going to create your project file that's going to reference this data. So I'm going to go back up under my public documents, and I already have a folder created called Louisiana since I'd already downloaded this before. And then I'm just going to select this folder. If you didn't have a folder already created, you could go to your whichever folder that you want to create a subfolder underneath and then create this new folder button, and you get a dialog box to enter a new folder name, and it will create a subfolder underneath the folder you have selected. So in this case, I'm going to, again, I already have the folder selected called Louisiana, and I'm just going to leave this checkbox checked, which means create new street map project, which means it's just going to create a new project file referencing this data. If I was just refreshing this data, let's say a year from now, if I already had a project and I just wanted to refresh my street map data, there's a way I could run this and just uncheck this box, and it would just simply refresh the data, but it would leave my project intact and wouldn't create a new project. So at this point in time, I'm all set. I can simply click apply. And as I do that, at this point, it's going to initiate the download process. And so you'll get a status bar here in the center indicating the status of your download. And so this can take a few minutes depending on your internet speed. And so as it goes through this process, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to download the compressed file, which in this case is approximately 213 megabytes. Once this data has been downloaded, then it's going to start the extraction process. So again, we'll just give it a minute as it's going through its download. It's almost complete with the download. Just a few more megabytes. And now it's actually extracting the data. And so it's going through the extract process. And again, this will take a few seconds or maybe a minute or two depending upon the size of the data set that you're downloading and extracting. And it's almost there. And it has finished its extraction process, and now I have this new project file. And as you see, I have the state boundary for Louisiana, and then I have all of these layers that's been added. And all of these layers are based on data that's been downloaded to my local machine. So at this point in time, it's already created this project file, and I could just go ahead and just save it again if I wanted to make sure. And that way, the next time I open Simple GIS Client, instead of creating a new project, I would just open up this existing project that's been saved. So just to show you that, I come here, I'm going to go to my File menu, and I'll say New Project. So again, this is the window you would normally open to when you first launch Simple GIS. But in this case, since I'd already created my project, I would just go to Open Project, go to the folder that contains the data that we just extracted, and I see that it has this street map project that's already been saved underneath there. And so I'll just open that project, and now I'm back into my project file. And again, I didn't have to do that. I just wanted to demonstrate once you've done this once, you don't have to re-download the data. Again, you can just simply go and open up the project that's been created. So at this point in time, you could go ahead and add additional data if you wanted to into here. If you wanted to look at some of the data layer that's included in this data set, you can expand any of these group layers. So these are actually group layers. And as you can see, as I expand this, I have layers for zip code, tabulation areas. I've got county boundaries, natural features such as water, forest, point of interest areas such as parks, zoos, graveyards, city and town boundaries, U.S. state boundaries. I also have layers for building footprints. For the roads, as I expand this, I can see I have the large motorways, which is really your interstate highways, your major highways, which are trunks, then your sub-major highways, which are your primary, and then your secondary highways, and then your smaller residential roadways and even trails. And then you have railways, city and towns. They're categorized by several different types of layers. You have your state capitals and very large cities. You have then just cities, then small cities, then towns. All of these are based upon population sizes, which governs the classification. And then you have places. In addition, you have a points of interest, which is amusement parks, aquariums, restaurants, fuel. So you can see all of these different points of interest. It's also downloaded. And all of this data, except for the state boundaries and zip code tabulation areas, those come from the U.S. Census Bureau. But all of the roadways and cities and building footprints, points of interest are all based on OpenStreetMap data. And as you zoom in, of course, you'll see more detail come in as you zoom in. So you're starting to see all of those water features come into play. You're starting to see some of the cities, so Baton Rouge, Lafayette. And again, all of this data is stored local. And so it is completely online on my machine. So at this point in time, if this was my laptop, I could take it in the field and continue to operate on this project and data set. In addition, you'll notice, let me just collapse some of these group layers here in my table of contents. You'll also notice there's a group here for breadcrumb AVL layers. And if I expand that, these are GPS breadcrumbs. So you can actually record your GPS locations to create breadcrumbs, and it will save those locations in this particular shapefile for you, and we'll demonstrate that in a minute as well. In addition, at this point in time, if you had your own local data that you also wanted to load into this project, you could just simply use this Add Data tool. As you click on that, and then you could add your local data layers just as normal in any Simple GIS Client project. And if you want more information on that, you can refer to some of our tutorials under the basics of Simple GIS. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, there is some data wizards. For instance, while you have internet connectivity, if you were to go to this data wizard and use the USGS National Map Data Wizard, you could connect to the USGS map and download data to your local machine based upon your area of interest. And for more information on that, there's also a tutorial that demonstrates using this data wizard as well. And so I'll refer you to our website to reference that tutorial. So at this point in time, I want to talk a little bit about the GPS receiver. And so for the purpose of today's demonstration, I'm using a GlobalSat BU 353S4. And so just for reference, I can pull it up here. So this is the actual GPS receiver that I'm demonstrating today. Again, this receiver supports the NMEA 183 protocol. And again, you can see it's quite inexpensive, and this is a pretty good receiver. So I've had good luck with this, and personally have used this for many years. So if you're using a GPS receiver that it provides its connection through a virtual COM port, then you will need to look at the configurations on that receiver and look at what its settings are. If you're using the GlobalSat, for instance, you can find those settings up underneath your menus at the top under GPS routing. And if you go to the Configure Routing GPS menu option, this is where you can specify those settings. So here's your COM port settings. So if you know what COM port your receiver is operating off of, you can just simply specify that. If you don't know it, that's fine. You can just have this, and by default, normally this checkbox comes in, but you can just check this auto scan ports. And it'll actually scan every port from 1 through 15 until it detects a GPS device, and then it'll stop scanning the reports. In addition, you need to specify the baud rate that the GPS receiver communicates on. And again, this will be found in your GPS's documentation. For this GlobalSat, it's communicating at a 4800 baud rate. Same thing with the parity, data bits and stop bits. These are fairly common. But again, if your GPS receiver supported something differently, you should be able to find that in this documentation and set this information. If you're using the OpenStreetMap, the local street map dataset project, then you don't have to specify any of these features. They'll be automatically specified for you. But as I mentioned, I believe earlier, one of the advantages of using this local street map data is it's fully routable and fully geocoded, and so it has its own routing and geocode databases that by using that project template, it downloads this information and goes ahead and configures these settings for you. And so you won't have to fool with these. And so I'm going to click Apply at this point. And so, again, if you don't know your COM port settings, let me back up 1 minute, go back to the GPS routing configuration. If you open up this configuration dialog box again, if you don't know your COM port setting and you're using the auto scan ports, when you go to establish your communication with your GPS device, this can take a minute or so until it goes through the scan and finds the COM port that your GPS device is communicating on. If you do know the COM port, you can go ahead and specify it and uncheck this box, and it will speed up the connection process with your GPS receiver. And so one way, if you have your GPS device plugged in and it's communicating, there is a way you can determine its COM port through Windows, and I'll show you that real quick. So normally, after you plug your GPS receiver into your USB port, there's an indicator light typically on your receiver that indicates whether it is locked on to a signal yet or not. And so most of the time I'll wait until the GPS receiver is indicating that it has locked on to a satellite signal before I start trying to connect to it or fool with any of its configurations. So for the GlobalSat unit, there's a very small LED on the base of the puck. That's a GPS receiver that normally, if it doesn't have a satellite lock, the LED light will be lit continuously. And then once it receives a satellite lock or is able to establish a satellite lock, it changes from a continuous LED to a flashing LED. So I currently have my GPS receiver plugged in. So if you did want to see what COM port your receiver was communicating on, if it was using the virtual COM port rather than the Windows 10 sensor API, you can come here under Windows and you can type in Device Manager and open up your Device Manager. And once that opens, you'll go down to the under the list till you see a section called Ports, COM and LPT, and if you expand that, you should be able to see any serial COM port that's currently being communicated on, which is the one. This is the one my GPS receiver is currently communicating on as COM3. Now I do want to stress, if your particular GPS receiver uses the Windows 10 sensor API rather than a virtual COM port, then you would not see it communicating on the COM port because it would be using the Windows 10 sensor API. So knowing that I'm on COM port 3, just so I can speed up my connection time between my GPS and my Simple GIS Client application, I can go back underneath my GPS routing menu, select the Configure Routing GPS. My COM port's already set to 3, but I'm just going to turn off the auto scanning and then click Apply. And so at this point, I'm ready to start communicating with my GPS receiver. So to start the connection process, there's actually a tool button here, kind of in the middle of the top row of tool buttons. And if you look closely, it looks like a satellite symbol that's grayed out, which indicates that it's currently not attempting to communicate or communicating with your GPS device. So to toggle the connection to your GPS device, you simply click on this button and you'll see it change from gray to red, indicating that it's attempting to communicate to your GPS receiver. Once it has established communication, it'll change from red to green, as you can see here. If you can see where my mouse is. So now I'm ready to start using the GPS. If you simply want to track your position on the screen, one of the ways you can do that, there's actually a tool button just a couple over to the right from where we click to toggle our GPS communication on. And it just looks like a radio button with a white center. If I click on that button, you see it changes from a white center to a red center, and you actually saw my map pan and change and center its location on my current position, as indicated by this red arrow. So I'm currently not moving, but this is my current location. And if I were moving, we would see this arrow change and it would start moving on the screen, and then once it got to the edge of a screen boundary, it would recenter itself into the screen. The other thing to be aware of, if your auto rotate option is on, it'll rotate the map to your direction of travel. And you can control that through a setting, either from this GPS routing menu option when you go to the Configure Routing GPS. If you click on this item, at the very bottom on the left-hand side is a checkbox that says Auto Rotate Map. As long as that checkbox is checked, once you're in motion and moving over a certain speed, then the map will automatically rotate to your direction of travel. If you don't want your map to rotate and leave north always to the top, then you would want to uncheck this box. And then simply click Apply to save your changes. Now, as I mentioned, this data set is fully geocoded, so you can enter in any street address that falls within the area of the data that you downloaded. So in this case, I only downloaded Louisiana, so the address or place would have to be within Louisiana, or you could enter even in like a place name. So for instance, if I didn't have an address, let's just say I had a town name. Well, make sure I type it correctly. And at that point in time, it would take you to that. So it attempted to, but it then brought me back to my location because I still have my GPS tracking on. So if I turn off my GPS tracking, and now if I enter in a town and hit enter, it would now bring me to that place. So again, it can be a place or it could be a street address, and it would take you to that location. If I turn my tracking back on, it's going to bring me back to my current position. The other thing you can do with this is, as I mentioned before, with tracking on, you can start recording breadcrumbs. And so to begin recording breadcrumbs, there's a tool button right next to the tracking button that looks like a clock. And if I hover my mouse over it, it says click to begin recording breadcrumb. If I click this tool, it changes from a clock to a red button with an X on it, indicating that it is currently recording breadcrumbs. And to stop recording, I just need to click that button again. Now, all of these points are being stored in this GPS breadcrumbs file at this point in time. Now, you're not seeing them currently because my map hasn't refreshed. If my map was to refresh, all of a sudden you see this blue star appear, which indicates that it has recorded some points in this GPS breadcrumbs file. And I could actually view the attribute data for these points by clicking on my View Feature Data tool. And if I click on this point, I would actually see it's actually recorded at this point up to 4 points already. It's just that my position is not changing, so all of the points are stacking up on top of each other. You can control the frequency of how often it records these points, again, underneath the GPS configuration menu. So again, if I go to my GPS routing, I come here and select my configure routing GPS. And at this point, on the right hand side in the center of the screen, you'll see a slider bar under breadcrumb settings, and it's the breadcrumb recording interval, which you can tell is currently set to 10 seconds. So if I wanted to increase the recording interval, I can just drag the slider bar, and I can see that this timer is increasing as I'm sliding this bar all the way up to 60 seconds, or I could decrease it and make it record more frequently by dragging it to the left, with a minimum value as every 2 seconds as the minimum recording value. And so once you have that set to the way you want it to, you just simply click apply again. I'm not going to save my settings at this point in time because I don't want to change my recording interval, but that is all you would simply do. And so you're currently recording. To stop recording, again, just simply click on this button again to stop recording your breadcrumbs. At this point, you'll see the button change back to a clock and indicating that it is not currently recording any breadcrumbs. If you had previously recorded a set of points and you wanted to clear those points out of the shapefile, let's say you were done with them, you can click on the button right next to the record breadcrumbs button that looks like a clock with a sweeping back arrow on it. And if you hover your mouse over it, it's going to say click this button to clear breadcrumb trails. And that's exactly what it'll do. It'll delete any breadcrumbs currently in this shapefile. So if you recorded some breadcrumbs and you wanted a permanent record of those, what you could do is export this shapefile to a new shapefile. And then once you were ready to start over, you would just clear out the points out of this shapefile by clicking this button. When you click this button, you'll get a confirmation asking, are you sure you want to delete all breadcrumbs? And if you say yes, it will remove them from the shapefile. Now the other thing you can do is actually use this for routing and navigation as well, especially if you've used the project template for the local street map data set. As I mentioned, not only is it geocoded, it's also fully routable. And so to do that, you can come here And there is a button right next to where we activated the GPS communication. It looks like a house. Again, kind of in the center of this top row of buttons, if you can follow my mouse here. And if you hover your mouse over it, the hint will say Show Simple GPS Routing Toolbox. And as you click on this button, you'll get a new dialog box along the right hand side of the screen. And you can actually look at a couple of things here, and this is actually already got some data in it because I have used this previously, and so it's picked up some data I already had. But if you wanted to, if you already have your GPS connected and it's recording, you could just check this box to use your current position, and when you check that box, it would actually put in your current lat long as your starting position. If you didn't want to use your current position, you could uncheck that and then type in a street address, or you can use this tool button next to this edit box at the top next to the start from to actually click on it and then click on a location on the map, which we'll demonstrate here in a minute because we'll add a few stops along the way for a route we're going to generate. You'll need to input your final destination, which again can be a street address or a place name, or you could click on this tool button to actually click your ending destination on the map. In this case, I don't have a specific street address. I'm just going to put in a city name. And then for some stops along the way, let me turn off my tracking so I can pan and move my map without it recentering on my location. So I'm going to come here to my top row of buttons again, and where I have this button that says where we click to start our GPS tracking, I'm going to click it again to stop the GPS tracking. And so what you'll notice is once I click this button, it'll change from a red center back to a white center, indicating it's not tracking, and you'll notice my arrow went away in the map for my current position. And so now I can actually pan and zoom on the map without it toggling back and forth on my map. So in this case, I don't know, I could just add a couple of spots somewhere along the way between these 2 points that I want to add as stops. And let me just find, I don't know, we'll find a location up here somewhere. And so let's say I had to make a stop somewhere in here. I had to make a stop off in between. And so in this case, instead of putting in a street address, which I certainly could, and hit the enter key to add it as a stop along the route, or actually just click the plus button here to add it. In this case, I'm going to use this tool button here underneath this stop next to this edit box. If you see where my mouse is, if I click this button and then click a location on the map, it'll add in the latitude, longitude coordinate of the location where I clicked at. And again, I'm going to use my plus button here on this box underneath that where it says stops along the route. I'll click on this plus button to add that as a location I want to stop at in between my starting location and my final destination. And I could add multiple stops. If I wanted to optimize the order of the stops to generate the quickest route, I could click this checkbox and it would actually change the order of these stops to be the most quickest or efficient way from getting from my starting point, visiting each stop, and then getting to my destination. If it was important that I stop at these locations in the order I'm entering them in, I would leave this unchecked, and then it would create a route from my starting location, stopping at each location in the order I entered, and then ending up at my final destination. When I've completed this, I can simply click the Calculate Route. At this point in time, it'll generate a route from my starting location. Is indicated by this blue line is the route that is generated. Stopping at this intermediate point that I entered is indicated by this red marker here, and then continuing on to my final destination. So I now have my route created. And so now if I wanted to, I could start navigation. And what this is going to do is if I click on this, it's going to start my GPS tracking as indicated by panning the map to my location. And here's my current position as the red arrow. In addition, if I was to start moving and as I got onto this route, it would start giving me turn-by-turn directions and actually using voice prompts to give me my turn-by-turn direction. A couple of things you may notice in this dialog box is it tells you the total trip distance and your total travel time, of course, which is all an estimate. And then underneath here in the black part, it gives you your estimated arrival time at your next stop. So if you had intermediate stops, it would be your estimated arrival time at your next stop. And then in the larger part of this black box would be in bold your next turn instruction. So for instance, turn left on LA 28 might appear in here. And it would also tell you an approximate distance when that turn would occur. And so as you continue to travel, it would track your position. And again, if your auto rotate map was on, it would be rotating the map to your direction of travel. You can also turn the auto rotate feature on and off from this routing dialog box here on the right hand side on this button right next to the navigation, either starting or stopping navigation button. And it's just simply an arrow pointing north and south in this case. And right now, this symbol indicates that my auto map rotation is on. If I wanted to turn that off, if I didn't want the map to rotate and I want it to north, always to be north, I could click on this button and it puts a red circle with a line through it indicating that the auto rotate feature is turned off. And again, to turn it back on, I can simply click the button again. The red circle and the slash through it disappears, indicating that auto rotate is back on. And so at this point, it would start my navigation feature. If I wanted to, also just as a mention of the functionality, if I was to deviate from this route for some reason, let's say there was an unforeseen detour or I had to make a quick stop somewhere, maybe that I had not planned in my route. As I deviate from this route, it would automatically recalculate my route to get me back onto my path, whatever the most efficient way to meet my next stop location. And so it does have the auto recalculate feature built in as well. If I needed to stop the navigation before I got to my destination, I just simply come and click on the stop navigation button here. Again, this is where we started the navigation, and since we are currently navigating, to stop it, I just click this button again and it would stop my actual navigation. And so that's how you can use the GPS receiver again, and this would all be completely offline. Now, once you were done with the routing, if you wanted to get rid of it, you just come up here to the upper right corner, click on the red X to close this dialog box. And so that is pretty much the GPS features that's built into Simple GIS Client. There is one layer that comes in here that I haven't made mention of if you're using this local street map project template, and that's this AVL layer. You may have noticed that underneath the breadcrumbs. This is a special layer for users that may be using this in combination with the Simple GIS server application. If users are running the Simple GIS server that's running on a server, and they are running the Simple GIS client on field devices that do have internet connectivity, either through a cellular modem or some type of network connectivity, they can have it report their GPS positions back to the server instance that would be collecting that for all the users. And it could also transmit back other users' locations that would come across in this AVL file. And so if you had a crew of people that were working and it was important for them to know where other crews were located at, using the Simple GIS server application running on the client's own server provides a method for them to get that information back out into the field. But if you're only using this for your own personal field use, then you really don't need that layer and could actually just remove it. Just right click on it and say remove to remove that layer. Once you are through with the GPS, again, it's still tracking right now as indicated by this tracking button. As long as you see that red in the center, indicates that it's tracking. You just click that to turn tracking off. If you want to stop communication with the satellite, you can click on this button again to toggle the connection off. Once you do that, you'll see that the satellite changes from a green back to a gray, indicating that communication with the GPS receiver is turned off and it's not even attempting to communicate at this point in time. And so that concludes this tutorial, and hopefully this has been useful. I do encourage you, as always, to visit the website for more information or also consult the user's guide. The user's manual for Simple GIS can be located underneath the Help menu. If you go underneath the Help and simply the very first option here called Simple GIS Client User's Manual, and if you click on that, it will actually open up the user's manual in a PDF document. If you go to the table of contents and scroll down, you'll actually see here in the table of contents an entire chapter configured using GPS. So you can simply click on that chapter heading and it'll take you to all the information about using the GPS features in Simple GIS Client. So with that, I'll conclude the tutorial for today. Again, please visit the website. That website is simplegissoftware.com. All one word, no spaces, simplegissoftware.com. Thank you. Have a good day.